Every communication device leaves a trail that is the fundamental premise of digital forensics. That is why investigators demand phone records, seize carrier data, and reconstruct communication histories from scratch. But that premise has a major blind spot. It only applies to devices on traceable networks. A satellite phone does not rely on a cell tower. It is not routed through local networks that keep domestic records like standard mobile providers do. Instead, it talks directly to satellites in orbit operating under completely different regulatory frameworks. These systems manage data retention and forensic accessibility in a totally different way than standard cell phones. Word is that Annie Guthrie had one. When investigators learned a satellite phone was linked to the case, they found a device operating outside the standard forensic reach, and the questions began to pile up. Because of this, finding a satellite phone in a domestic tragedy like this is anything but routine. The vast majority of people in the United States do not own satellite phones. They are expensive to buy, costly to maintain, and require a highly specific service plan. More than that, they have a very clear purpose, keeping you connected far beyond normal cell coverage. We are talking about remote woods, international waters, and places cut off from standard infrastructure. Anyone who owns one made a conscious choice. They need to communicate far beyond the reach of standard cellular networks. That choice could be completely innocent. Maybe they travel to remote areas, need it for work, or simply want a reliable backup plan for absolute emergencies. Or it suggests they knew standard cell tracking with its tower triangulation and records simply would not do. Investigators are not jumping to conclusions, but they are digging because digital evidence is already driving this case. Keep in mind, this is a case where mobile data and GPS tracking for Tommaso Chionis, along with deleted text messages, became the bedrock of the entire investigation. Having another device that completely bypasses this forensic dragnet cannot be dismissed as a coincidence. Every device sends signals. Every single communication leaves a trail somewhere. The mystery is knowing where they are, who holds them, and what legal process gets them. With a satellite phone, those three answers look completely different than they would for a normal cell. And in this investigation, that difference means the forensic puzzle is far from finished. Let's break down how this technology works, because understanding it reveals why this device matters and what investigators are chasing. Standard cell phones route through towers owned by domestic carriers like Verizon, AT&T, or T-Mobile. Those carriers answer to United States laws. They store logs of calls, text messages, and exact tower location data. Federal agents can get their hands on these files fast using standard legal channels. Satellite phones use networks like Iridium, Inmarsat, or Globalstar, some based inside the United States and some not. The exact information they keep varies by provider. They usually keep call logs, but message contents, precise locations, and data retention windows differ wildly from standard carriers. Snagging records from an international provider requires a completely different legal process than dealing with a local carrier. Sometimes investigators rely on mutual legal assistance treaties, and other times they negotiate directly with foreign court systems. It is a slow, grueling process, forcing police to identify the network first before they can even request the files. When investigators learned Annie Guthrie had a satellite phone, the immediate questions were all logistical. What network does it use? What logs does that network save? And what does it take to get them? Finding answers takes time, suggesting authorities were chasing this satellite lead behind closed doors, long before it went public. This is where the timeline gains a massive sense of forensic urgency. The inquiry has already built a highly detailed timeline of calls around the days Nancy went missing. That timeline includes records from Annie and Tommaso, their phone calls, and their text history. All of their digital activity has been recovered and woven into the master timeline. But that timeline assumed everything was complete, that the devices already found and forensically analyzed recorded every single message sent during that critical window. A satellite phone, however, completely shatters that assumption. If the device was active in those tense days right before Nancy vanished, the night she vanished or right after those messages exist in records the police may have never even accessed. Those calls actually happened. They are stored on some satellite company server, but they were likely never part of the initial digital sweep used to build the original timeline. A sudden gap in communication during a murder investigation is never neutral. When detectives piece together a timeline and hit periods of absolute digital silence, they have to explain that void. If the silence was real and no calls were made, that tells one story. But if that quiet patch was actually spent using an entirely different hard-to-trace channel, like a satellite phone left off the initial evidence list, then the narrative changes completely. The satellite device does more than just add fresh data. It could explain the black holes in the current timeline that investigators could not explain before. This brings up the biggest question, the one detectives are obsessing over: when did they get that satellite phone? How often was it used? Did they carry it constantly or only power it up for very specific tasks? Does its activity align with key locations, events, or critical moments in the case timeline? Those usage patterns can be mapped out using provider logs, call times, and exact durations. Not to mention the digital breadcrumbs of the connection itself. Knowing which satellite the device pinged reveals their rough location during every single call. A satellite phone used regularly over the years for legitimate everyday tasks tells a very different story than one showing random sudden activations, especially if those moments align with key dates in the case. If the phone sat idle for months but suddenly sparked to life right when Nancy vanished, that pattern becomes highly relevant forensic evidence. It would suggest the device was powered on specifically because of the crime rather than for normal daily chores. Apparently, the police know it exists. Whether they have already obtained the full call logs through legal warrants, and whatever those logs show is precisely what keeps this loose end active as an open line of inquiry. There is also a geographic angle to this satellite phone that the public has largely overlooked. These devices are vital in dead zones with zero cell service, rugged backcountry, or when traveling abroad. If Annie Guthrie was off the grid without any cell reception during those critical windows, or if she needed to coordinate without leaving a trace on local cellular networks, the satellite phone gave her that exact capability. Most of the search efforts have focused heavily on the Tucson property and the surrounding desert. The rugged Arizona wilderness has massive dead zones, depending on your carrier and exact location. What is more, if any activity tied to this case went down far from Tucson in truly isolated spots, or chosen specifically because they are completely off the regular communications grid? A satellite phone would have been the ideal way to maintain contact. This ties directly into the haunting question of whether the disappearance of Nancy unfolded entirely on the main property, or if other locations which police may or may not have discovered yet played a part in the crime. Owning a satellite phone points to someone deeply familiar with places far beyond normal cell coverage. Knowing how to navigate those harsh, isolated areas and understanding remote wilderness, especially in a case involving physical signs of burial and concealment, is something detectives cannot dismiss as a mere coincidence. Let us look closer at what this satellite phone actually means. To the narrative timeline, investigators thought they had already locked down. The initial digital forensics rested on the assumption that standard carrier logs provided the complete picture of all communication. Deleted messages from Tommaso GPS routes. And that digital silence at key moments was mistaken for a complete record of all their communications. Investigators truly believed they had access to every single one of their communication channels. They assumed the same with Annie, her phone records, digital footprint, and that post-incident call to a close family associate. All of that was reconstructed using standard carrier data. If a satellite phone was active during those crucial moments, the current timeline is simply incomplete. It is not off track, but something is missing. A channel nobody bothered to check. We are talking about messages and calls on an entirely different route, invisible to standard phone tracking. Now, the prosecution faces two paths. Either the satellite phone was used during those critical hours, leaving a timeline gap only that device can explain, or it was not used at all, which would make its presence incredibly suspicious, though, without changing the forensic case they already have. Proving which theory is real requires records directly from the satellite company. And obtaining that data per company and jurisdictional law seems to be an ongoing struggle rather than a completed task. Here's the thread connecting this discovery to the midnight tip and the elaborate cover-up plan they uncovered. Hiding the evidence here, according to forensics, was an incredibly meticulous and scattered operation. Remains beneath the backyard documents shuffled into old storage boxes. Items in a rented storage unit, a hidden room at home, and something buried near the property. A satellite phone fits perfectly here, completely bypassing normal forensic sweeps. This is a device whose data cannot be grabbed with simple subpoenas sent to local cell providers. A tool that, if you know even a little about digital forensics, lets you keep conversations private, far away from the initial sweeps police usually run. Being tech-savvy, knowing that normal calls leave an indelible footprint, and that everyday communications are easily traced, reveals the exact level of cunning this case has already hinted at. Like the deliberate deleting of messages, creating blank spots in the timelines, and using off-site storage to hide what would not fit at home. In that light, a satellite phone is not just a way to talk, but another gear in the cover-up machine, a tool chosen knowing full well that normal mobile calls would eventually end up under a microscope. What this new channel could expose goes far beyond basic calls or saved text messages. Contact lists on these phones, just like on any modern smartphone, store directories of heavily dialed numbers, and those saved contacts might never show up on traditional phone records. We are talking about people Annie contacted in secret, desperate to prevent standard carriers from tracking them. If someone connected to the case pops up on that secret list, like Tommaso the associate who got the first call after the incident or another suspect, that link becomes absolute gold, proving they were speaking on a channel designed to leave zero trace. And if numbers show up that investigators never even had on their radar, people whose connection to the crime was never once detected during standard mobile phone sweeps, this satellite phone could open up massive, highly critical avenues of investigation. In complex cases with so many people potentially knowing the truth, the entire web of contacts is never fully clear until you check the very last device. This phone could expose fresh witnesses, key informants, or direct accomplices who somehow managed to stay completely off the police radar. That is exactly where this find fits, outlining the detective's very next move. Police had been operating under a logical premise built on the evidence already in hand, specifically that the communication analysis was already wrapped up. The cell phones were swept and all data was analyzed. The digital tracking of communications during that critical window was already complete. A satellite phone does not invalidate that work. On the contrary, it expands it. It opens a new path requiring forensic analysis before investigators can claim the picture is complete. In practice, this means securing the records from the satellite provider through the appropriate legal channels for that specific carrier, then comparing them against the existing timeline. They must track calls or messages in that critical window, identifying every recipient, to determine if there were contacts that should have appeared in the original forensic file but mysteriously did not. If those satellite records reveal nothing of interest, or if the device was only used for legitimate reasons unrelated to the case, this lead is dead. A dead end that drained precious investigative resources without delivering any evidence. But if they show calls in that critical window to unknown contacts in areas matching physical evidence, the entire scenario shifts. Not radically, since the forensic case file is already quite well established, but significantly filling a communication gap that was previously impossible to explain, exposing contacts and locations that were completely off the radar of the investigators until now, and adding another layer to a concealment strategy that already seemed highly sophisticated. Let us look at what this discovery reveals about the maturity of the case, because the timing of this public leak is crucial. This investigation has been active for about 5 months. If Annie Guthrie had a satellite phone linked to her communications during that key period, it is almost certain that investigators knew about it long before the media ever caught wind. Inventories of digital devices are typically completed right at the very start of any major investigation. They are identified, logged, and sent straight to the forensic analysis queue. The fact that this detail is emerging publicly 5 months in suggests several very different scenarios. Either they found the device early on, but have spent months navigating legal hurdles to get those records, a process that can take many months depending on the carrier's jurisdiction. Or perhaps its relevance only became clear as the broader analysis moved forward. Or perhaps they only uncovered the device through a source or record that literally just came to light. A satellite phone is the digital equivalent of a backyard burial, a conscious choice to bypass standard tracking. They knew perfectly well that certain calls could not be made normally if they wanted to keep them out of investigators' reach. The trouble is, investigators almost always uncover everything. The backyard surrendered the remains. The hidden files gave up the documents. The warehouse revealed that strange object. And the satellite provider, regardless of where its servers sit or the legal hurdles involved, will hand over the data because nothing stays hidden forever. It is simply kept in a different log held by another entity and accessible through a different legal avenue. It appears investigators are already walking that legal path. The most surprising thing about the satellite phone is not its mere existence. It is what that existence implies about what they thought they knew of the call history, every gap detected in standard phone data. Every moment of digital silence that seemed coldly calculated. Every single gap where Annie fell silent just when agents suspect something terrible was happening. Now all those gaps must be reevaluated under the suspicion of an alternate channel missing from the initial reconstruction. What looked like absolute silence might have been a conversation, just through a different route using a device that links to satellites rather than standard cell towers, with a provider whose records they are only now trying to obtain. 5 months into this federal homicide investigation, a satellite phone raises new doubts about a call log they considered finished. This is no minor detail. It is discovering that the map they were working with has uncharted territory, and federal agents are extremely meticulous when drawing any map, regardless of how far off the beaten path it might be.